Up next, please welcome John Carlin, partner at Paul, Weiss, and strategic advisor and chair emeritus for cybersecurity at Aspen Digital. Our lineup today includes Alexandra Reeve Givens, president and CEO at the Center for Democracy and Technology; Nadine Farid Johnson, policy director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University; and Jennifer Brody, Deputy Director of Policy and Advocacy for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House.
Great, and delighted to be back at the Aspen Cyber Summit. It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years. Our next topic is one that's really new since the creation of the summit. I think it's a major area, and it's one that sits at the heart of national security concerns, law enforcement concerns, human rights and civil liberties concerns, and figuring out emerging technology. What are the risks posed by it? We have a great set of panelists with us today who respectively lead some of the major civil liberties groups at the edge of technology, democracy, human rights issues. And we thought we'd start off with a description of their group's takes on it, but really, what is the problem posed by so-called commercial spyware? And back, 25 years ago when I was doing this space and actually working, I was with the Center for Democracy and Technology at the time, commercial spyware was something that was put on your phones, raised privacy concerns and maybe backdoor criminal concerns, but the purpose of the spyware that was put on your phone was to figure out what you were doing so it could be marketed. That is not our topic today. Today we're going to be focusing on spyware that is used intentionally by governments in order to obtain information for intelligence purposes. And also we're going to focus on companies that both, one, design such a product for commercial use and sale to governments, but also companies who that is not the primary purpose of the technology that they develop, but it is abused or known to be abused by governments who use it for improper purposes. So maybe starting there, what is this problem and why should we care?
Sure. Do you want us to do introductions of our organizations too? Great. So I'm Alexandra Givens. The Center for Democracy and Technology, for those of you who don't know it, is a 30-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to protect civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. In the US, we work to counter the abuse of spyware as one of the topics we work on. We also have the privilege through our Europe office of leading the Spyware Coordination Group, which is a coalition of 15 human rights and journalism organizations that works to address spyware use in the EU and advance responsible regulation there as well. The reason we care about these issues is because of the extraordinary implications for human rights and democracy. When you can have technology put on somebody's device without their knowledge, without them even clicking on a link, and have such extraordinary surveillance of every contact in their phone, of where that phone is going, of the search history, of emails, can take over control of the device, it wields an exceptional power to the operator who is using that technology. And we have seen time and again the instances of abuse. Abuse by using this against journalists and their loved ones, like in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, abuse against human rights activists and political activists, and then raising major national security concerns against elected officials as well, with notable examples very recently, even this year, uncovered in the EU, or against members of Congress and others, US officials, like in Uganda, where the US embassy officials were found to have spyware on their phones, or efforts to target members of Congress with spyware as well. This raises really significant concerns, again, for privacy, for freedom of expression, and for people to be able to do their jobs in a safe and secure way. And so that's why we're glad to have it featured at the summit today.
And Nadine, you're at a university now that focuses on First Amendment rights. How did you come to focus on this issue?
Yeah, So the Knight Institute was founded several years ago, actually coming up close to our 10th anniversary, to address the issues of free speech in the digital age. And so part of that is, of course, looking at platform transparency, accountability, now AI governance, and a big undercurrent of all of that is privacy and surveillance. When it comes to the mercenary spyware, the misuse of mercenary spyware, I'm going to echo a lot of what Alex said, because a lot of this has to do with the highly invasive nature of spyware. The fact that it is able to catalog basically everything a person does, all the information on one's phone, all of that private information, and all of that speech that should be protected speech. And so when you have a situation in which governments are able to access this information, it's often used by authoritarian governments we have seen and other governments, and we know that it's used to spy on at least 12 to 13,000 people a year. That's all we know. There could be obviously quite a few more. And it undermines the ability of individuals such as journalists to do their job. I know we're talking a little bit about our case that we have that's pending on this. But it really does, it is an incredible chilling effect that spyware has. And so it's something that we can talk about how we can regulate it, what we can do about it. But I'm really glad to be here talking about it today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today. I work at Freedom House. We're a nonprofit organization founded in 1941 in the United States, and we fight for freedom for all around the world. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy and Advocacy at the organization, focused on the tech and democracy portfolio. So why does Freedom House care about spyware? Again, echoing my colleagues on the panel, it's a threat to human rights defenders and journalists around the world. Freedom House does a lot of work to combat transnational repression, whereby governments reach across their borders to silence dissent. Freedom House research has found that 19 of the 49 governments who are perpetrators of transnational repression have misused spyware. And then just to reiterate a bit what Alex mentioned, that this technology is also a threat to national security around the world. Alex mentioned that members of Congress have been targeted with this technology, including Representative McCall, Senators Murphy, Hoeven, and Peters. US diplomats have also been surveilled abroad, and US citizens have been surveilled. This is a threat to the American people. For example, Karine Kanimba, she was meeting with Congress to advocate for her father's release for a Rwandan prison when she was targeted. John McCain's campaign manager was also targeted, and a US citizen who worked for Meta was targeted abroad in Greece. So there's kind of a plethora of issues why this is a problem.
So Freedom House famously ranks countries with the, and comes from the perspective that some countries are free and others are not free, and that you can differentiate. And so when we're talking about the use of this technology, what are legitimate use cases? Do you accept that there are legitimate use cases? And one problem in particular that's been articulated in the past by both here in the United States, by the FBI, by state and local law enforcement, is that with the advent of technological change, when they go to serve lawful process, a search warrant, other types of process, that the company upon which they serve the process is not able to effectuate it. And there were similar, as you know, statutory reforms around another technological change, which was the use of the telephone, that led to a legal regime that allowed you in certain cases to get real-time intercept of communications. Do you think that there is a legitimate purpose for, I think one of you used the phrase mercenary spyware, and if so, for whom, and how do we evaluate when it should be lawful?
Well, I think we need to look at a couple of different things. One is that I know that a number of the companies that are purveyors of this technology will state that it is made for quote-unquote legitimate uses, that it's made to combat crime, that it's made to address issues of terrorism, for example. I think that if we are looking at that from, to bring up your law enforcement example, we need to look at the entire panoply of laws that we have that might address this. And In the US, we have a strong Fourth Amendment, we have wiretap laws at the federal and state level. So I think ostensibly, if there's going to be any kind of effort to use this kind of technology, it would need to have a warrant, and they would need to be compliant with those laws. But I also think that this is a little different. Spyware is different. And one of the reasons for that is that, as I mentioned earlier, it is so incredibly invasive. And so there is really a question that even if we were to have these procedures that we already have in place followed with respect to current federal and state laws, that there are real questions about whether a warrant would be sufficient to protect someone's constitutional rights based on the information on the phone. So I think there's a lot to be considered before we make that leap.
And there's current, maybe as you jump in on that, Alex, I see you going for the microphone, but there is a current executive order in place. It dates to the Biden administration, but it has not been revoked in the current administration. There's been some discussion about whether it may be revoked or modified. But the presumption of that executive order is that there are appropriate uses, but one needs to run through a series of analysis as to both the risks that may be posed to the user, but also ensuring that the provider is not involved with oppressing human rights and other civil liberties, and look at who else they sell it to. What do you think of that executive order and that approach?
Sure, I'll let others chime in as well, but over the series of about 2021 through 2023, we saw a number of really important steps taken in the spyware case. And the reason was because of the extensive investigation around abuses of Pegasus software and the extraordinary number of use cases in which it was being used against human rights advocates, journalists, politicians, and other leaders. And so the Biden administration, in coordination with a large number of other countries, both led in an effort that resulted at the Summit for Democracy around a pact for what leadership like this could look like, and then the executive order. Energy that we still see continue today through the Pall Mall process, which I know we'll talk about. So we are seeing some leadership from countries around the world on this, saying that what we need is, at very minimum, extraordinary due diligence from the companies that purvey this software as to who is using their tools, what misuse looks like, and the types of security that they can have and guarantees they can have around those misuses. At the same time, it is very hard to make that due diligence work in practice, and we continue to see abuses manifest time and time again. And so that is why people that come at this from a privacy, human rights perspective do make the case that spyware is different, that extraordinary level of surveillance capability that isn't just, looking at a phone after the phone has been seized, but is ongoing forward-looking surveillance without a person's knowledge that is being used by people, no matter who the end customer is. Others then are being able to access this and use it as part of human rights abuses, really is deeply problematic. And so yes, the executive order is a really important step. We need to have this administration continue to uphold it and have America be a leader in this and participate in the international processes and give those meaning as well.
I do one follow-up, and then I'm going to turn to you, Jennifer, to talk about the Pall Mall process and the international approach. But for each of you, we think about law enforcement and the military. You have high-powered binoculars, you have infrared technology, you have actual weapons, guns, semi-automatic weapons, bulletproof vests, batons. So a series of equipment that is sold with the idea that it can be used for lawful purposes, and then we certainly see abuse of that same technology in other regimes. You've talked about how in some ways this is unique, but is it unique? Is it more? Where does it rank on that scale of the other tools that law enforcement and militaries are allowed to have and use?
So, again, I think it's important to look at this in terms of how it might be used in context, right, and how it is used. And one of the things that we need to consider with respect to spyware in particular is that the use of spyware is actually enabled by the subversion of technology on one's phone, right? Technology that is promulgated and put forward by U.S. companies, right? It is finding and exploiting vulnerabilities in software. It is using well, it will be no longer because of a recent case I can talk about, but WhatsApp, for example, it finds a way to exploit those vulnerabilities, which I think is actually an economic consideration that is pretty considerable when we think about how this might kind of play in the bigger field. And you are right, we have all the technologies that you mentioned, John. But with each of these, and I think now with Spyware, if we're going to consider looking how best to even contemplate using them, the first thing that we need to do is to have a strong framework in place. Now, Congress has, on a bipartisan basis, I think, done a really good job over the past couple of years. Actually, more than a couple of years, we've done a job in the past probably 3 or 4 years, where there have been now a number of frameworks put into place with respect to how the intelligence community is permitted to review and procure this type of technology. And I think that there is an opportunity there to expand that framework and to ensure that we are, to Alex's point, really putting into place some incredibly strong strictures and parameters about how this might be used. So I think I look at this as being an opportunity to strengthen what we have, and to, again, put America in a place where we are continuing to lead on this and to recognize that it is a bipartisan issue, and that we can put these frameworks into place in a way that will be more protective of national security and of Americans' privacy.
And you touched on, so let me just follow up while we have you on the one problem that I'm not sure it's unique, but it's certainly different in this space, would be that there's one set of companies developing a technology to defeat the technology of another set of companies, all located potentially in the United States or in the country of origin. And you mentioned a lawsuit that you're involved with, and what's up? Why don't you tell us a little bit about a use case and what you've been doing in that suit?
With the lawsuit. So the Knight Institute has the privilege of representing 22 journalists and other members of the Central American news outlet El Faro. These individuals were targeted over about a 14-month period in 2020, 2021. And the targeting of their phones increased as they started to publish stories that had to do with criminal behavior and human rights abuses by the Salvadoran government. So on behalf of those clients, we sued NSO Group in the Northern District of California, Federal District Court. And we have asked the court to order NSO Group to identify, return, and then delete all of the information that was seized from the phones during the course of the targeting, and to identify the clients on whose behalf this surveillance was ordered. Right now, the case is actually we're having an argument just in a couple of days from now. It is the motion to dismiss, renewed motion to dismiss, is being argued in district court right now. So that's where we are in the case.
Anything from that suit that you think we should consider in terms of legislative changes to make it easier to bring such suits in the future?
Absolutely. And actually, that's one thing that not only this case, but a number of the litigations that we have seen happening in the U.S. And other parts of around the globe, is that it's been very difficult for individual victims of spyware to be able to have their cases heard in court on the merits. There have been a number of procedural hurdles that have slowed these cases down. One of them has been, for example, in the Dada case, the district court initially dismissed the case on the grounds of forum nonconvenience, essentially stating, to kind of simplify it, that the case was too foreign to be heard in the U.S. because you had plaintiffs that were from a different country and you had a company that was headquartered in a third country. But what I think is really important here is to recognize again that this type of surveillance is enabled by the exploitation of U.S. software, of U.S. servers, of U.S. services. And so when that happens, Congress has an opportunity to legislate explicit venue and jurisdiction provisions that would allow for that type of situation to be heard in a U.S. district court.
And moving from the U.S. internationally, we've heard the phrase that I feel sure if I polled the audience, most people would not know, which is the Pall Mall process as an example of an international framework. Jennifer, I know you've been involved in that process. Could you describe first what it is and then what you think of it?
Sure, happy to. So the Pall Mall process is a multi-stakeholder initiative led by the UK and French governments to combat the proliferation and irresponsible use of commercial cyber intrusion capabilities, including but not limited to spyware. This past April, the initiative published a code of practice for states that includes a number of commitments that reflect in great part steps that the US government has taken to combat the proliferation and misuse of these tools. I'll also flag the US government is a signatory to the Pall Mall process code of practice for states. Some of these measures include leveraging sanctions, which the US government did. The Treasury Department sanctioned the Intellexa Spyware Consortium. The code of practice encourages visa restrictions, which again, the US government did. They created specific spyware visa restrictions that would apply to people involved in the misuse of these technologies or those who financially benefit from them. The code of practice also calls for the use of export control authorities. Again, the US government did this by placing NSO Group and Candor on the entity list. It also calls for the consideration of government procurement measures to address this threat. Again, the US government did this, the executive order Alex mentioned. It also even calls out the importance of victim access to justice. And to Nadine's point earlier, that continues to be a really challenging hurdle to overcome.
And so we have the conceptual basis, the Pall Mall process. And I know, Alex, you in particular have been involved with the EU's application of it. And could you describe a little bit the work that you do there? And also, interestingly in the EU, I think there's been a difference between how some countries are using some spyware providers that others would say are mercenary, to use the term, and should not be allowed for use by governments for their law enforcement intelligence purposes.
Sure. So much as in the US, this has been an area of focus for a number of years in the EU, and they actually created a special committee to lead an inquiry into the misuse of commercial spyware, the PEGA inquiry, that lasted for a number of years and had important findings that came out as a result, really documenting for the first time the extent of the use in Europe, including by European member states, and showing kind of who the victims were, including a number of members of the European Parliament. One of the things that we are urging in Europe is for the Parliament to continue building on the work of the PEGA inquiry by actually considering what type of legislative mandates and reforms they should build on. One of the main levers that is kind of in play in Europe is their dual-use regulation. So in 2016, they began looking at the use of their dual-use regulation, again, a regulation that looks at these technologies that can have kind of two purposes, to see what it should do in terms of export controls and others in the space of commercial spyware. And a couple of years ago, they came out with an update with regards to commercial spyware that puts in more obligations around due diligence. Again, some of the similar themes to the executive order and actions that we saw in the US. That's a good first step, but our organization is in the middle of doing an analysis of how countries are actually applying this in practice. So at the EU, you have action that happens at the EU level and then implementation at the member states. The member states actually need to make good on this promise and be kind of conducting the due diligence, making sure that they are thinking about their export controls in this manner. And unfortunately, time and again, we are seeing limitations there. First of all, just a real lack of transparency around how decisions are made, around who's on the good list, who's on the bad list, how people are how companies are evaluated. That is an issue we also have in the United States. Again, that due diligence, how to make it effective and meaningful. And then really one of the main faults that we see is just a failure in systematic approaches to end-use monitoring. It's one thing to have good intentions and good policies on paper, but how are companies actually making sure that their clients are using this for lawful purposes and not in violation of human rights norms? So in Europe, there is a lot of work to be done, actually making good on some of the energy that we've seen there. And at the same time, to your point, we're seeing a different divergence between some member states. So for example, in Italy right now, there's actually a piece of legislation on the books that would bar companies from telling their customers when they think they are the victim of a spyware attack. So that is a very different approach than what we think is the majority approach amongst democratic nations of making sure that there is that transparency and accountability.
Would it bar it regardless of who the perpetrator is, or does it only bar it if it's done through legal process?
To my understanding, the first draft cuts a pretty broad swath. One could anticipate a more narrowed application. But again, it raises this real concern where people are thinking solely with a law enforcement bent as opposed to realizing the extraordinary examples we're seeing of misuse and the type of systematic approach we have to be able to address those abuses.
And thinking about dual use, Nadine, what do we do with companies where they are not developing the software with the purpose of selling it for the cyber intrusions or as spyware, but it's a technology that's capable of being abused? What should the responsibility be on the company?
So that's a really good question, and I think it comes back to this idea of what people's expectations are of their own privacy. And to Alex's point about the idea that there could be a good intent in terms of the development of the technology, but the lack of transparency that we have right now in terms of understanding who the clients are and for what purpose this technology was sold to different clients makes it really challenging to figure out that framework. You know, there is an entity list that the U.S. government has, and NSO Group is one of the companies on that entity list. We have also seen entities come off of that list. There was a company called Sandvine that had been on the entity list, and then through an agreement with the U.S. government during the previous administration, was removed from the entity list because it agreed to a series of steps that it would take to essentially disconnect from some of the clients with which it had previously engaged. There are still questions about what processes are undertaken to make that happen, what criteria are used, and even with the current executive order, we have seen now an effort that there was an agreement between a company called Paragon and the Department of Homeland Security, and that was quashed initially for about a year, I think, and then recently the stop work order on that contract was lifted. There is a process that is within the executive order that requires again a series of steps and a process to be able to evaluate a company and the use of its technology, but we do not yet know if that process was followed, again, what kind of criteria were used. And so I think we still come back to the same foundational concern about this type of technology, about how it tends to be used, about its propensity for abuse. And there needs to be, I think, maybe some kind of, I think just an initial process that we undertake where we are working with our partners and we're encouraging our partners to not give safe haven to these entities before we can move on to even considering other uses for the technology.
When you think about the safe haven issue, what do you do with the fact, if you think of the Freedom House terminology, some countries are considered free, some are not free, and one of the purposes behind the policies that you've all discussed is that we're trying to discourage the sale of these products to not free countries, with the idea that an authoritarian country will not use it in a way that's respectful of civil liberties or democracy. But they get a vote too, and if you prohibit the use of countries in the EU, in the US, other Western countries, or countries that have signed up to, that are ranked free, if you don't allow those companies to sell, the authoritarian countries, why wouldn't they choose a product made in the PRC or elsewhere? How do you incentivize them to change their behavior rather than change their producer?
That's a challenging question. I mean, I think to the extent possible, right? Our vision is, right, like when we're thinking of the democratic ideal, that we're values aligned, right? And that, right, democracies that respect privacy, freedom of expression, et cetera, will prefer rights-respecting technologies for their citizens. In practice, as you mentioned, right, the PRC technologies are often cheaper, and people vote with their wallet, so to speak, so it's a conundrum. I don't think I have a great answer. Anyone else?
I would say on the one hand, it's a hard question, but it's also an easy question, right? It is a perennial statement of any democracy that, of course, you can stop doing something and the bad guys are going to do it anyway. But we have to live our values, right? And send a message on a global stage. The US is a global leader on these issues. We are partnered with Europe and other countries that have stood for the principle that human rights, that civil liberties, that responsible guardrails on technology matter. And so if we're not standing by even those basic principles just because, hey, they can go buy a bad tool somewhere else, I think we're giving away a lot more than we need to.
All right, and that concludes our panel today. I want to thank the panelists very much for engaging with this timely and difficult issue. Thank you.